You're listening to the We Are Libertarians podcast network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
Episode 160, The Paradox.
Welcome to The Paradox with your attending, Dr. Eric Larson. He is a practicing anesthesiologist and clinical assistant professor at Michigan State University College of Human Medicine. Listen in as he takes you behind the scenes of what practicing medicine in today's ever-changing world is like with another doctor. The Paradox is a fun and accidentally informative show for physicians, patients, or anyone who has ever found themselves in a waiting room.
Welcome to The Paradox. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Larson. Thank you for joining me as we explore the U.S. medical system in a fun and informative format through expert analysis. I'm sure today you're going to enjoy the conversation as much as I had having it. I'm with Dr. Meg Edison again. She has been on for a long time, actually been far too long, and we're going to discuss some things that are maybe a little bit in the weeds for the average person. But if you're a physician, you're familiar with the Board of Medicine. Each state has it. They're the ones who provide disciplinary action against physicians who are behaving badly, and it's a place where if you're a patient, you can lodge complaints. And we're going to talk about her two run-ins with the Board of Medicine in the state of Michigan. The first is with a badly behaving physician within her own practice. And then we're going to talk about her personal experience that she had this last year, which was sort of humorous and comical in the sense that it all turned out okay in her point. But it was a case of misinformation, someone who actually was trying to cancel her. And it was an interesting process, and we're going to talk about that. You can find out the rest of the story about the sort of ridiculous nature of this complaint, but one that is a real problem that can happen to physicians, right? When you face board action, you can lose your ability to practice medicine and your career for allegations in this case, which were spurious, but they could certainly be ones that are harder to disprove perhaps and put you in real trouble. So I think you're going to enjoy that discussion. We'll also go into talking about organized medicine, what's going on with certification. And so again, if you're a patient or if you're a physician, you're going to find a lot in this program, and I think just have a lot of fun with the conversation as we did. I'd like to remind you that if you're a new listener from We Are Libertarians, thank you so much for joining. Make sure you subscribe to the show. If you've not yet subscribed, hit the subscribe button on whatever podcast player you're using. Also, make sure you leave a 5-star review. I only accept 5-star reviews. Just kidding. But go ahead and leave a review. I'd appreciate it. And the reason the show's grown so much is because you're sharing it with your colleagues, your friends, your family. And I appreciate that so much. I can't tell you how much it means to me that so many of you are sharing with your friends and reaching out to me. You can always send me an email at The Paradox Show, and that's spelled the way the show is spelled, with a DOCS. So The Paradox Show at protonmail.com. If you have show ideas, people you think would be interesting to interview, I'm always looking for new topics, things that obviously relate to medicine. Try not to focus too much on COVID, but boy, it is just always coming into conversations. And today we're going to talk a little bit about COVID, but mainly because it just relates to the story and the actual action that was brought up against Dr. Edison. Also, if you'd like to go to Patreon to support the show, all the money and proceeds that are raised goes towards the production and promotion of the show. You can go to patreon.com/theparadox. I'm not sure if it can be technically called an Easter egg if I actually tell you that it's there, but at the end of the show, after the solo, you get a nice outtake from the show, and I feel like every time I have a conversation with Meg, we have a moment, and this time it was my clock that was going off and our brief little conversation waiting for the clock chimes to end and for her to finish her answer. But without further ado, risking the loss of your medical license for allegations of misinformation with Dr. Megan Edison. Enjoy. All right, well, welcome back to The Paradox. I'm here with my longtime friend, Dr. Megan Edison, a pediatrician here in Grand Rapids. And she's been on the show twice before. It's been quite a while, 130 episodes ago or so, or 140 now. I think it's episode 20. And we talked, again, a little bit what we're going to talk about today. So we talk about legislation and physicians and sort of medicine. So thanks again for coming on and bringing your expertise to the show.
No problem.
Well, you've been an advocate for a long time. We've known each other for years, and we both have been in organized medicine. And organized medicine is, I guess, a loose term to say that you're in like an association or some sort of society, like the State Medical Societies, American Medical Association, specialty societies, like you'd be in the AAP, I would be in the ASA, which is anesthesia. So anyway, we're going to talk about stuff that's going on in the sphere of licensure. And so you've had some, why don't you tell us a little bit of your story of what's gone on with licensure?
Okay, you got to be more specific.
Okay,
What you want
so
me
we're going to talk to be more clear, I want to talk about medical licensing. So for those who are not aware, licensing in the state is done at the state level. It's not a federal licensure program for physicians. I think for most professionals, actually, I think most of them are done at the state level. We are a federalized system, so to speak. And so there are various rules, and these boards, whatever they're composed of bureaucrats, of usually people in your profession, and sometimes some citizens. It kind of just depends on the board makeup. People there are requirements to get your licensure, whether it's education and continuing medical education in our case for physicians, and then you have to conduct yourself in a certain manner, and you have to not commit fraud and those sorts of things. And so, of course, anytime there's a board, there can be people who file complaints, because if there's someone who does something that is not doctorally right, they should have an ability to, I guess, a grievance, or I'm not sure exactly what the term is. But so why don't you talk to us about your license? You've been licensed state of Michigan, as I am. Talk to me and the audience about what you've gone through with licensure recently with the state of Michigan.
Okay, so I think the topic that you want to get on is, I guess, licensure for physicians, and kind of this overlap for how do we keep good doctors practicing, and how do we censure bad doctors, and how do we keep that from being a little bit too onerous sometimes.
Sure, like a speech issue. Here, okay, sure.
And I guess I've had a little more experience with the Board of Medicine recently on a couple of cases. So I've learned a little bit more about the Board of Medicine, at least in Michigan recently, how you would report a bad doctor, how the whole process would work. And then more recently, I got the experience of going through having been reported for, I guess, providing misinformation.
Right. So I guess
just really, really embarrassing, kind of stressful process to go through, but it had a normal outcome. Nothing happened to me, but it was a good experience to see how this process works.
How much can we disclose of the previous thing without, or if you feel comfortable talking about much of it, or
which
with your previous partner?
Okay, so the first experience I ever had with the Board of Medicine was actually my boss a few years ago. Ended out losing his license in the state of Michigan because he sexually abused an autistic patient. So I got to kind of experience that whole process of how the board works, their testimony system, how they investigate, and then he ended up losing his license eventually. So that was my first kind of experience with that. I thought it was had a good outcome in the end, but through that process I got to learn about this in other states, how when doctors behave badly, there's often not as much censure. They can go right back to practice medicine, after just, maybe a few months of a time off. So, well,
we had, obviously, most people are familiar with the Nassar case, right? That is probably the most famous recent issue with licensure, or at least with doctors behaving badly in the state of Michigan, where he sexually abused scores, hundreds, I'm not sure how many athletes with his associated with Michigan State University, and then also with the U.S. Olympic Gymnastics program. And so there's, I think, a distinction that that I know you learned in this process, that there is a Board of Medicine action, but they have limited abilities in what sort of evidence or things that actually count, right, as actionable, and then what they can't use. Like, I think, most people think, oh, there's a felony committed. Well, then clearly they're going to lose their license, right? So why don't you go into that? Because I know that was kind of surprising to you when you first went through this with your partner.
So with my partner a few years ago, that the thing that was, I guess, surprising to me, and was surprising, I guess, I realize this is an issue nationally, is that when a physician, when it comes to like sexually abusing a patient, that doesn't, what often will happen is they can get reported to the Board of Medicine, they can maybe lose their medical license, or maybe just get censured and go back to practicing a little bit later. And then that's, they just stop practicing medicine. They don't go to jail, they don't, nothing's in like the sex offender registry, nothing like that, because the Board of Medicine is a very separate entity from law enforcement. So that was definitely a problem in Michigan, where you can do something really bad to a patient and it just kind of gets dealt with within the medical board and doesn't actually ever go over to law enforcement. So these people can just stop being doctors and then they could just go be a teacher or a camp counselor or
Right.
a youth pastor, and you would never know that this person did something really horrible and lost their medical license, because there's nothing in the news, there's nothing, in the, sex offender registry, nothing like that, because it doesn't actually go through the legal system.
Right. So if they have some, application, have you ever committed a felony? They say, well, no. I mean, they may have lost their license because they sexually abused 10 people or something, but
Yeah.
Until it reaches criminal charges, right? And so it's a separate process, basically, what you're saying.
And sometimes it just won't go in that direction for whatever reason. In Michigan, there's a kind of a funny loophole where if you report somebody to the Board of Medicine, and the Board of Medicine, they really can't go report it to the law enforcement. They're supposed to just do the kind of stay in their lane and only work on the licensure portion of the offense.
And it's all secretive, right? I mean, in the sense that it's not public as far as what the investigation is going. So there's no reason for law enforcement to know what the Board of Medicine is, and the Board of Medicine is they're not allowed to tell law enforcement what they're up to, so to speak, right?
It'll sometimes go the other way. Like if you were abused by your doctor and you went straight to the police would then tell the Board of Medicine, and then they would get the board part going. But it doesn't work the other way. If you think, oh, this doctor abused me, I tell the hospital, and then the hospital reports it to the board, no one's going to tell the police.
Yeah.
So that's where there's a disconnect there.
Sure.
So.
And the average person's not going to think to do those things, right? Like, you just want to get this person reporting, to get the ball rolling, so to speak, right?
Super
and so you may
common.
not.
People, when something happens, they're like, what's like just the least amount of authority I can report this to? You see something bad, you're like, I'm just going to report this to the doctor's boss or the hospital. You don't really think I should go to the police, so I think that's pretty common. I think that even happened in like the gymnastics community. They thought, I'm just going to report it to the owner of the gym or maybe the USA Gymnastics, and then it never went to the police.
Right. Yeah.
So that's pretty common, that you just don't, sometimes you aren't thinking this was a crime, I should report this to police.
And when it comes to, I have a little bit of experience too with law enforcement and with crimes and things like that. So it's not guaranteed when you report something that it necessarily is going to be acted upon. Like, you could report a crime, and if the prosecutor doesn't have the resources and the time, bandwidth, whatever, they may not do anything, right? I mean, you can't prosecute every crime that comes into your office because you just don't have enough officers or whatever. So it's not surprising, I guess, in some ways that gets dropped. But it then becomes a tragedy when you have someone who, like a Nasser, right, who's clearly was reported many times. There are lots of suspicions, but kind of no one was there looking from an aggregate view, like, this is a problem, right? This guy is an issue. So things happen, right? And then someone hears a report of one thing and they think, well, maybe it's just one, not realizing there were 20 other issues with that person,
these
right?
people are really good at what they do.
Well, they're right. They're experts.
They're really good at lying, and you won't see it coming. So like Nasser, having gone through this, I can't really blame anyone who worked alongside Nasser for not seeing it, because you just won't. They're really good. They're really good at living a lie, and you will not suspect it. It's very disconcerting.
Well, you're dealing with generally intelligent people too, right? Who are probably maybe even more effective at covering crimes or deviances. And I'll see this in anesthesia when we have people who are diverting medications and using opioids for themselves, or nurses and other people. They're usually, it's not easy proving that they're not like caught with their hand in the cookie jar usually, right?
Yeah.
It's like they're signs and they're things you just look for, but it's not like they're walking around inebriated and like stumbling around. When it gets to that point, they're really, they've been doing it for quite a while. So people are extremely, good at this sort of. I guess if you're not, then you're caught very quickly, and that's the end of that. But so then let's talk about your specific instance, because this is because I think it's really interesting, because we've heard a little bit about this in the news more of, concern about if people are giving, I don't know, misinformation is kind of a dumb term right now, but it's maybe the best is when you have a difference of opinion, or people think that trying to cancel people, I guess, is another sort of way of looking at it. What specifically happened with you, with your practice, that got you reported to the Board of Medicine?
I know, this is, again, nothing came of this, so I'm I'm fine. But it definitely changes your opinion when you kind of see how this process works. But I had a family report me to the Board of Medicine for what they called misinformation. And it was, the way this, I guess, works is when you make a report, at least in Michigan, the way our board works is it's, and this can be a good thing or a bad thing, it's 9 physicians, and then there's 1 PA, and then 8 just regular citizens. Mm-hmm. So that's considered to be a good thing, I guess, for public trust, because it's not just a bunch of doctors kind of keeping things amongst themselves. You have community members who are on the board, and that's supposed to be a good thing. But where it can be maybe not that good is there's not going to be that medical expertise. So I guess what happens whenever there's a report to the Board of Medicine in Michigan, everything gets addressed. So, anyone can just report a doctor for anything. It doesn't have to be the patient. You just heard them say something that you didn't like, and you can report them, or you're a disgruntled employee. Anyone can do it. And so they have to address everyone, and they can say this is just bogus, and they can throw it out, or they can say we want more information. And so in my case, I guess they put it out to whoever decides, and one person was on vacation, another person was, said, yeah, maybe, and another person didn't respond, and so it ended out the police officer had to give me a call and figure out what was going on. So was it a police officer? That it was a former police guy. So, okay. And the whole process was very, very unusual. So I got an email just in my Gmail account from some guy who just said, hey, I have a licensing issue I'd like to talk to you about. And I was like, oh, well, okay. I don't know. Maybe Why would you respond to that? Did some authority like his signature or something? It was in my Gmail, and I was like, well, that's weird. Because I think it's a scam. I mean, I know. I would have missed it otherwise. And so I Googled his name. I was like, he actually works for the state of Michigan. I think this is legit, right? And so then the next day I had a call from this guy at my office, and I was like, well, I think this is probably for real. But I was like, I don't know. Is it my CME? They just want me to give my receipts? I don't know what this is. So anyway, so this guy called my office, and so I did end up talking to him. And I'm sure if you have libertarians listening, they're like, you should never talk to police.
What's your badge and number?
I was, I guess, naive in retrospect, but he just wanted to talk to me about this case, which I told him I honestly did not. I knew the family. I just didn't remember the actual interaction in the office. It did not raise any red flags after the visit where I thought, well, that was a really awkward visit.
Didn't seem like it.
Nothing at all. It was just my normal day. I don't remember anything about it. My charting didn't reflect anything unusual in the interaction. But the 3 things that I was reported for, and I told him I didn't really recall saying these things, but he told me what they were. One was that I told the family I didn't think cloth masks would prevent the wearer from contracting COVID, that I didn't anticipate the FDA approving the vaccine for young children anytime soon, and that there was COVID in the deer population in Michigan. So I said to him, like, well, okay, I don't really recall that conversation with the family, but of those 3 things, the first one with the cloth masks, that's actually information from the CDC that I was giving. I would give the family if they were asking me, if you're really concerned about contracting COVID, you should wear, a higher quality mask. You'd be wearing an N95, something else is a cloth mask. Probably isn't going to do a great job of protecting.
And that was absolutely the CDC initially, right?
CDC
they were
saying
it protects the other people, it doesn't protect you, right? Yeah. I mean, that was kind of the word.
So that was from the CDC. The next item about the FDA it still isn't FDA approved, right? But for sure at that time,
correct.
They weren't for young children, and it still to this day is not fully FDA approved for the younger population. So that was FDA's information I was giving. And the third was from the DNR, where they had studied the deer population in Michigan that showed that the 70% of deer at that time had COVID.
Strangely, most of them had Omicron now too. I'm not quite sure how.
So I was sitting here, and the guy was really nice, about the whole process. He just felt like he had to just get the information, and I ended up getting dismissed. But it was disconcerting. I'm like, I gave in the office information from 3 government entities, and yet I still got investigated by the government for just repeating what they said,
Right.
So,
So first question is, of course, is this a new family? Is this someone you?
No.
So they knew who you were. They knew what you're like. You knew what they're like.
I don't know. This has been a really rough time for a lot of people,
Yeah.
And so I think maybe people are on edge, and sometimes it's hard in pediatrics because I have some families who don't take it seriously enough, and it have been perhaps too cavalier. I have some that take it too seriously to the point that they're causing harm to their children. So you have to somehow find a middle ground here where, let's just, take care of our kids as best we can, but we got to also live life too.
Do you think it took a while for that to get to you? Like, I'm wondering if that was the information you gave out, and then they're coming back in 6-8 months, where now if that family went up, the family say, you know what, you're probably right about all that stuff. Now
I think they reported
obvious.
Maybe right away. So in some of it too.
But it was like last summer. You know what I'm saying? Is
I think they reported within a few, maybe a month after the visit. So, but this was still accurate stuff at the time I was giving it, right? And sometimes we are maybe more paying attention to the actual, stuff that's coming out.
Sure.
Maybe they weren't getting that from whatever media sources they were. That's supposed to be our job, right? Is to stay on top of it and be honest and
right.
But shoot, man, that was just weird.
Well, I think COVID's definitely broken our brains, and it strains relationships.
Yeah.
When it comes to vaccination, you're a pediatrician. That's kind of like half your job is getting kids vaccinated from potentially harmful childhood diseases and avoid harm, right? That is sort of what the AAP is all about from a patient advocacy point, is keeping kids safe. Let's talk about that, because
Are you trying to get me in trouble?
I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I think it's an interesting conversation because we don't oftentimes talk to pediatricians. I'm lived with one, but when it comes to safety culture, I've read a number of pieces recently, people discussing safetyism, or the move towards removing risk from life. And I think one of the questions we got real early on from our family, we have a foster son who has a kidney transplant, as you know, and so he's immunosuppressed. He's on medications to suppress his immune system so that he doesn't reject his kidney. And we got asked very early on by someone, what are you going to do with him? Are you going to leave him at home and stuff? And our answer, I think, when I talked to you about that too, is, well, the reason he got a kidney is because so he can go and live.
Right.
Certainly, he's young, so he's otherwise healthy. So for all those reasons, you think his chances of a bad outcome are lower than someone who's like 65 in a kidney transplant. But still, where do you draw the line? And I feel like people have had really struggled with trying to figure out safety. And I think in some part, I'm not saying the AAP is responsible for this. They're not but I think that culture of ultra safetyism is pushed within medicine. And I think, pediatricians are certainly on the front lines of that in some ways, because because we always want kids to be safe and to grow up healthy and happy, right? So what are your thoughts on that? And how do you think, has COVID changed your approach and view of safety and risk and stuff, or at least how you address it with the parents?
In general, in pediatricians, we're known as kind of the killjoys when it comes to safety. We don't have, the trampoline. We, don't let our, kids eat hot dogs, all these things, we're just super, because we have, like we were talking earlier, we have a horror story for every normal thing that you wouldn't think twice of. We all have a story where we heard of or took care of a kid who had a horrible outcome from something really common. So we are, on one hand, killjoys. On the other hand, we are also the ones when it comes to when it comes to just infectious diseases, we're the ones that are usually calming families down.
Right.
These are it used to be, when families would call, their child has a fever of 103, 104 in the middle of the night. Our job is to reassure and kind of calm them down, talk them off the ledge often when it comes to infectious diseases. Right. And this is one where it's kind of we haven't been able to do that, or that's not okay to do in this case. That's been really hard. I'm used to, being able to have the normal fever talk and have people feel reassured. And sometimes now I'll give that fever talk, and I sometimes get the sense that some families just don't like to hear that, or they don't maybe they think I'm being cavalier about
or dismissive,
that.
right?
Yeah,
Like of the dismissive
and
concerns, yeah.
And I'm not, but I also I've taken care of kids a long time, and COVID is, it's kind of behaving, thankfully, similar to a lot of the other viruses that we deal with all the time, So it's taken us, I think, a while to realize that. I don't know that the AAP is doesn't sound like they're coming around in that direction to kind of allow us to go back to the normal advice we would give families. It's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. I mean, I feel the tide is turning slowly, and at some point it'll just be a watershed and everyone's going to kind of sort of say, yeah, it's okay. But I agree that we're not quite there yet. I think with the, when it comes to fevers and reassuring people and normal infectious disease, I think COVID is certainly looking more and more like a cold, especially for kids. It's almost always been. I think overall, I think you can safely say it's worse than a regular cold, whatever a regular cold is, but like the typical sort of runny nose sort of thing. It's worse than that, but it's not like orders of magnitude worse than like the flu or something like that, which is the flu can be pretty bad too. But,
and at least in my experience, when I had a kid come in looking really sick in the office, I'm pretty sure it's not COVID. I'm pretty sure when they come in looking real sick, it's going to be RSV or it's going to be flu, because they tend to look really terrible. And the kids that come in with COVID, thankfully, they're not, sick in the office.
Yeah, right. I mean, and I think everyone has a hospital where they have a few kids who are really sick for whatever reason, either genetically unlucky, they have other pre-existing conditions, whatever. I mean, that's the one thing in medicine you will find, whatever you do. I mean, I was just talking with my partner today that about every week I add something to my list of things I don't ever want to contract or have, right? Like someone has something happen to them and you're like, how could this happen? I took care of someone who had a piece of countertop fall and mess up his knee. And you've had people who have horrible traumatic injuries at factories and just like you, if the kid has Lego that, chokes on a Lego or something, right? I mean, or get drowns in a washing machine. I mean, horrible things like you don't want to think about, but those sort of things happen. But I guess you have to sort of keep risks in mind. So we mentioned the AAP, and I'm going to try and get you in trouble with every organization right now, but I mentioned AAP because it's not really any different than any other specialty societies in the sense that there seems to be a certain, maybe not coordination, but sort of acceptance of certain levels of authority more than others within professional organizations. I think AAP defers a lot to the CDC, the FDA, even though prior teaching or general knowledge or assumptions about sort of childhood development and things like that were different from the AAP. We see this in, all the societies. So I don't want to pick on the AAP specifically, except that, the kids thing is like a really big issue right now as we speak with schools and masking and, virtual learning and all that kind of stuff. And the AAP has provided scientific or at least professional credence to a lot of these proposals from the federal government. Do you see the AAP as one that it can be reformed, or at least I guess to be fair, maybe a better way of putting it is like if you're a member of the AAP and you think I think this is misguided, or I think this is they're worried about something that I'm not as worried about. What kind of feedback loop and mechanism is there? Because I would say for the American Society of Anesthesiologists, I don't think there's really any way. We have some reps and things like that, but it's really hard to get a message saying, I think your stance on X, Y, or Z is probably not helpful, or maybe not everyone agrees with this, or it's not a consensus, right? Like you would hope that any organization is going to have, if they're going to put forth any statement, that there's going to be a consensus that is very broad and that it's very heavily supported by its members, like 80% or something like that. Not something that's 55-45, right?
Yeah, like the AAP. I'm a little, I guess, disappointed. Your observation is totally correct. It did not seem like they were making their own independent assessment of what children need. It just seemed to be repeating kind of some party line, which I was kind of disappointed with because I had hoped that the organization would come out specifically focused on kids, and kids' needs. And so that doesn't seem to be the case. And I don't know that hopefully they'll backpedal a little bit, but I don't feel like many pediatricians can really say a whole lot.
Yeah.
It's, you don't want to get a mob after you or someone accusing you of not taking the disease serious,
Right.
Last year we would do these roundtables with the medical society with legislators. And you're on this call with ER doctors and internists and ICU docs, and then I'm a pediatrician, right? So I'm not really seeing what they're seeing, but they're not seeing what I'm seeing, And I think there's also a lot of fear among healthcare workers of actually getting COVID as well. That kind of maybe, their judgments were a little bit different on what they thought as well. But it was hard. I just never said anything the entire time. This is when we were totally locked down. The kids weren't in school. You couldn't get your hair cut, all this stuff, and you felt like you couldn't say anything because I'm a pediatrician, right? I'm not seeing what they're seeing, and so it was a little. It still is that way too. I mean, a few people will maybe voice some concerns about the kids, and then you'll have another voice coming from inside the hospital. Right. You just feel like you just got to shut up.
Yeah. Well, it's tough when someone comes to the story, they're saying they're seeing death and disease. I mean, and unquestionably they were, right? You're seeing the hospitals fill up. Yeah. They're just not filling up with kids. And so, I felt like the AP took a lot of stance, and actually even they say in their statements that they were sort of standing up for teachers, which, is admirable that you want to care for everyone who's caring for your kids. But you have to recognize that you have to do what's best for the kids too sometimes. And I think it was pretty clear early on that the kids were not a big vector of disease, unlike in most instances in which they are, like with flu and things like that, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to organized medicine, like the state medical societies, or the American Medical Association, it's easy to kind of become discouraged. And just like I said, AP, you can't really affect things within your specialty society very easily as far as getting input. But what's the utility for physicians to get involved? I mean, because I think it's easy to say, these guys are all, the AMA, they're just in bed with the government, or they just want to do whatever, they're all for universal health care, whatever it might be that you don't support. What would you argue for someone who doesn't agree with a lot of those things that maybe the sort of the popular sort of opinions within these organizations? What's argument you make for being involved in this sort of thing? Because I know you've been involved in Michigan State Medical Society for quite some time.
I think it's worth getting involved. I think you have to figure out where you can have the most impact, right? Mm-hmm. So for me to get involved in the AAP, it seems kind of pointless, right? Yeah. I'm not going to be able to change that. So for me, getting involved locally with the medical society here in Michigan, that's, you can have your impact there. So, but some people maybe they've been doing a lot of stuff with the AAP and they can, make a difference in that arena. Great. But yeah, I think it is worth it because that's how change happens. I mean, that's how.
Well, right. The AP is issuing statements that people are taking, right?
Yeah.
Or the the Michigan State Medical Society is issuing a statement, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not there, you can't have any impact on that, right?
Right.
And I would say a different thing from the AP, from the specialty societies. Let's just stop picking the AP because that's not fair. It's nothing special about the AP. It's a specialty society. But when you look at medical societies, but the broader medical societies where you basically represent doctors, American Medical Association should obviously be the natural national sort of society for this. There are other ones, the APS, that are much, much smaller. There's another one too I can't think of right now. There are other groups that represent doctors in various facets. But when you think of like who represents doctors, usually it's the state medical societies that are the ones who are seen as the ones representing doctors, right? And so when there's a legislation or regulations that come along, they don't ask for input. I mean, they ask for input from the hospitals. Insurance companies probably more than physicians, but when they look for the physician's input, that's where they go, right? So that'd be another argument, I suppose, to be involved in organized medicine, so you can be in there, because a lot of things happen that aren't even legislative.
Yeah, even this was just, you've talked about MOC a whole lot, but it's kind of been heating up in Michigan again too. I was contacted by a few doctors in Michigan where Blue Cross Blue Shield is behaving poorly again, which is hilarious because they've been behaving for 2 years now and suddenly they're not behaving again, which tells me that the pandemic has got to be winding down if they're starting to harass doctors again, right?
And so to be clear, I guess to get background, so when you say MOC, you're referring to maintenance certification, which is when you get certified and board certified, then you have to maintain it by doing certain things.
Yes.
Like
and in Michigan, there was legislation passed that prevented the insurance companies from discriminating against doctors for not purchasing this MOC product. So they were supposed to stop harassing doctors. And so they did for a while, but now they're back to harassing doctors. And the only place that you're going to be able to get that help to kind of get them to back down is from your medical society. They're the only ones. You alone can't go and talk to Blue Cross Blue Shield. They're not going to listen to you, so having them there, and you can call them up and they can give you the advice, and they meet, regularly with these insurers, and they can help you out. So there's, huge benefit.
And they certainly have access to legislators too, right? Like they have relationships with minority and majority leaders in the House and the Senate and the governor's office usually, and I don't say bureaucrats generally, but just people within the human services department. So, so it is like most things. You have to find your place in whatever the organization is, and where you, like you said, where you can make the most impact, where you have the most talent. I mean, some people are better at coming up with legislation, working with legislators. Some people are better keyboard warriors and organizing people. Other people are just idea people, right? I mean, so there's different roles that you can have with that. But I was very skeptical because of getting involved in organized medicine, and I was convinced by one of my older partners to get involved, and it's been, I think, helpful. I mean, I think I've met lots of great people, and you can affect legislation and things like that. So now, of course, you have to
wasn't I convinced by one of your older partners too?
I tend to think I might have been the one responsible for you.
It was like,
I think
it was like this trickle down, right?
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah, I think he got us involved. But so when it comes to getting involved locally, I mean, you obviously been involved with MOC. We go to our medical society and we work on resolutions. I don't want to say fighting, but certainly providing different viewpoints from other physicians in the state, because everyone's got a different idea of how things should run. Not only just because from political reasons, but also from specialty reasons, right? Like dermatologists or like orthopedic surgeons and neurosurgeons, they may cross paths as far as with the privileges in the hospital, like they both work on backs or whatever. So, what do you think? What do you think the chances are of MOC moving further? Of getting it enforced? Like, you say they're violating the law. Well, I mean, you can break all the laws you want. If no one's actually enforcing it, you can do what you want. So do you think what do you think is the
next step?
Well, what's the problem? Is it a executive branch thing? Is this like the wrong person's there, or they just don't see it as a problem?
For the insurers, you mean?
I think to give a little better background too, essentially, if you remove the certification from the insurance company, they can say, we're not going to pay for this person because we only pay for people who are certified. And so if you're not maintaining your certification, so it's discriminating against physicians who are not maintaining the certification, even though they were, originally, they got their board certification in pediatrics or anesthesia, but they don't continue we'll call it busy work of continuing and paying the money for these products, then they risk basically losing your job, essentially. I mean, you can't bill for anything. You can't get any money unless people pay you cash, which not much of medicine works that way.
So now that I think we're 4 years out from the legislation, I guess my view is probably changing a little bit on how you kind of manage this beast, because our legislation only covers pediatricians, internists, and family doctors. And now I think probably the way you manage this is by having more choice, actually. Probably not just getting rid of MOC, but having choice in how you maintain that certification. So I think particularly the National Board of Physicians and Surgeons is probably having that as an alternative for the insurers to allow in their credentialing is probably the way to go, is my guess at this point. They just got approved by NCQA, which is the kind of overarching board that tells the insurers what's kind of, high quality. And so for a while, they only specified ABMS boards, but now they've allowed this National Board of Physicians and Surgeons, and so now the insurance companies should be open to allowing that for kind of credentialing with them. So that's kind of where I see it going at this point.
Well, that's kind of remarkable that they got that.
Oh yeah,
how do they do that? Because I mean, that's
magic. Yeah, I don't know. It's impressive. Yeah.
I mean, it's so. This is very complicated. This is very much in the weeds, but it affects you if you're a patient. Having these physicians suddenly disappear, right? You have the ABMS, which I've described before, is American Board of Medical Societies. That's all those ones we're talking about. The American Board of Pediatrics, American Board of Anesthesia, American Board of Dermatology, right? All these specialty boards. Yep. They have various criteria. They give you you get board certified after your residency and fellowship, and then you have to maintain it. And usually, it used to be just for life. Now it's you pay money and you have to do stuff to get, and basically spend a lot of money and time to maintain your certification. Yeah. And that is all through those boards. And it was basically just the ABMS that was the one that
they were the only ones that were kind of considered a quality measure for the insurers. And so the insurers often they kept on saying the reason why we're doing this is because ABMS is the only one that is listed as a quality measure, and now the National Board of Physicians and Surgeons has also been listed as a potential quality measure. So,
and if you're a doc, you can go to nbpas.org. I think that's their website, where basically what it is you have to have an active medical license, you have to have finished a residency, you have to have been board certified. You can't just say, now that I don't want to do
you have initial certification.
You actually have to finish a residency and actually be a specialist in something, and then you pay some money so they can maintain a registry. And then a lot of these organizations they're all private, right? They're not public in the sense that they're not government run, but they have clearly a relationship, and the government uses them as proxies for quality, like you mentioned with this, because this NCQA or whatever is still. It's private, right?
It is private. And
it's like some foundation or something. I'm sure it's a 501c3.
Overlap from the board of NCQA and the American Board of Medical Specialties. So there's definitely overlap. That's why it's quite miraculous that they allowed another board to be certified. So.
Yeah, it makes it challenging. And to get back to the licensing part, when it comes to the state, every state has different licensing requirements, and so. There have been calls for licensing to just be national, right? Why don't?
Because one medical license for
right, and I mean I can understand the argument for that, because I wouldn't think that if you've gone to barber school, let's say if you feel like you had a licensing for barbers, that there'd be any reason that they couldn't go into Indiana and cut hair or well, heck, I mean most professions, right? I mean there's no reason you couldn't go and do. I mean it's not like medicine is significantly different in Michigan versus Tennessee. We use the same medications. I mean. There's really not much difference in the law. So what would your argument be against that? I mean, because you could see arguments that it favored, because now I have to if I want to have a telehealth program, I've got to get licensed in 50 states. Well, talk about regulatory nightmare, right?
Largely, I think because the discipline of physicians is at the state level, right? Mm-hmm. So it still is, if something bad happens, you're going to be disciplined by your state board of medicine. What's your alternative? Are you going to have a national board of medicine that's going to discipline you?
Right.
That could get messy as well too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you move it further from the people, so to speak, right? Like you always worry about. And of course, when you look at the licensing requirements in the states, they vary. I mean, the amount of CME or the types of CMEs you need. Some state thinks you need to know about X, Y, or Z. Another state thinks, I'm sure there wouldn't be a requirement in Kansas to know about like shark safety, but maybe it'd be useful to have physicians be familiar with that in Florida, or like rattlesnakes, right? You don't need to worry about it in Maine, but you probably do in New Mexico.
Yeah. Well, I think, obviously telemedicine has opened this up. So many people want to have a license in multiple states. So, we do have the interstate licensure compact, which Michigan is part of now, where you can go in and you can get a bunch of licenses at once. There are private companies that'll do this for you too. Obviously with all the telehealth companies that that would pop up as well, people that are going to help you figure out how to get all of your licensure that you need and make sure you're doing all of the educational requirements and everything. So that's probably an easier way to work around than having a national license, don't you think?
Well, probably, yeah. Well, I think so, and one that's more responsive. I think you'd want a board that's more responsive. Can you imagine if you're running a national board and you'd have millions of complaints all the time?
I can't even imagine. There are probably so many complaints they deal with already, and then there's also times where they fail and don't go after doctors like they should.
Right.
That would be way worse if it were a national
system. We definitely know. It's just when we're like, I can't believe this person still has a license, right? Because you hear some story like, how did this person, were they practicing like doing surgery out of a pole barn for like 4 or 5 years? You're like, it's crazy that this sort of thing can occur. Yet it does. And then you get cited for saying, cloth masks might not be that helpful.
It's so
right?
sad.
Do you worry about, it kind of goes along brings me back a little bit to the thought of with physicians and their online presence, because now, you have a much bigger platform than you used to have 20 years ago. I mean, 20 years ago, you could say whatever you want, and for the most part, unless you're in the room with someone, they're not going to know, right? But now you can tweet about something or put a Facebook post or write a med page today or whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of avenues for getting your voice out, which is, I think, a good thing for physicians, but I think it also poses some risk. Do you think that the environment is changing such that you worry more about that, or do you think this is just
yes,
or do you think it's just like a temporary blip that 2 years from now we're gonna be like, that was we just lost our minds and now we're okay?
I don't know. I mean, on one hand, I feel like the kind of social media mob has a very short attention span, so they just kind of go after one person and then they just, after 48 hours, they've moved on to the next, so if you just kind of ignore something, it probably they'll move on to someone else. So, but yeah, you have to be super careful about what you say. Like, I just don't even really post a whole lot of anything. No one knows what I think, I guess.
Until now.
Until now.
Now you're screwed.
I know. I'm in. Yeah, you're like, I want to talk about.
I'm just slowly ambushing one doctor every week in my show. That's my goal. Yeah. See how many people I get their licenses revoked.
Yeah. Let's talk about this controversial topic where doctors are getting their licenses revoked. We're saying controversial things. Great.
Would you recommend for new physicians to maintain a social media presence?
There's no way.
So if someone comes into your practice, you say, you know what, I just don't think it's worth having, because there's an argument to be made that it's useful having a brand, right? And that maybe it depends what kind of physician you are, right? Like your plastic surgeon, a brand is much more important than someone who's a radiologist, right? Who's just going to be sitting in the dark. No apologies to the radiologist friends out there.
Yeah. I think it's hard because you don't know sometimes you can't predict what's going to be offensive.
Right.
And so things that you probably wouldn't have thought anything of suddenly could be, it's a tricky time right now. I don't know that you would get enough benefit out of it to be worth the risk if you're a young person or young. I watch on Twitter some of these med students saying things, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I really hope you're pretty anonymous, because you don't want, who's going to want to have you in their residency program? Some of the stuff you're saying.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's definitely one of the searches right now, right? When you hire someone, you're looking at their social media presence, and I think maybe even if some of you are in training, I think there's definitely some concern when you're residency or certain medical school getting into residency. But probably even more so is landing a job afterwards, right? Like if you are somewhat controversial, you may have a group that just doesn't like that sort of viewpoint for whatever it might be, and they're not going to really evaluate you on who you are. They're going to evaluate like what you've been saying, like instead of like, oh, this is a competent person. They seem very personable. They could fit in. They seem to fit in with the culture. They look at you and say, wow, this guy's kind of a lunatic that they're talking about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think the area of misinformation is so nebulous that. Yeah. It's changing by the week, what's considered misinformation, so if they put out that they're going to go after doctors for saying things that might be misinformation, I probably just not say anything. I don't know.
Yes.
and it's terrible because the debate is what is so important, right? So, when you and I, when we go to these medical society meetings and there's debate, I learn so much from that. I go in and I think I know how I believe or what I think about some topic, and then I hear people from different parts of Michigan, different types of practice, and I totally change my mind.
Oh yeah, all the time.
And that I think is really, really part of what we should be able to do, and maybe that's something that just has to take place behind closed doors and should not take place in public. I don't know, for a while.
Yeah, I think the big problem right now when it comes to that is the fact that we're not having these debates we're not having where they should be happening. We're discussing things like, well, let's just look at, COVID's obvious example because it's broken everyone's brains, right? We're not able to discuss this openly. People can't disagree. But where these discussions should be happening, whether we should have a mask policy, let's say, for children in schools, we shouldn't be having some edict come down and then a bunch of people just yelling at each other online. We should have a discussion at some place of higher learning. That's the whole point of a university and an academic center of medical schools, right? That you have discussions, you bring in people with opposing views, and if they're charlatans, you expose them for who they are, right? If you don't say, well, you can't talk to this person because they're so crazy that if their views even get out there, they're going to pollute minds. And what happens is just so.
Can you imagine in retrospect if we had done that, like actually, like had doctors?
Well, and not necessarily. Not necessarily doctors, right? Like, if you have a thing in school, right? If you have the school mask, you have people come in, epidemiologists, and say, "What's the evidence for this?" And people can argue one way or the other if there's good evidence or not. You have people come in who are child development specialists. They're not necessarily physicians, but they can tell you how important it is to see faces or how not important it is to see faces. And you can have people who come, psychologists talking about the importance of this, and teachers, their concerns about being infected. I mean, you'd have more stakeholders involved in this sort of thing, but you have to have it in some format where you can actually have honest discussion. I feel like we don't have any of those. The places where those should be happening is universities, I think. I think that's naturally you'd have it. You're not going to have it on TV. You're not going to have like Crossfire where you have 30, each have 30 seconds to have these. You got to have a long, Joe Rogan's in the news right now, but the reason is he has a long format where you can actually talk to people and get into, you need to have that sort of long discussion.
You're not trying to do a long format here, are
no,
you? I don't know.
No,
okay.
we're almost wrapped up.
Okay.
But I think, you have to have a forum where you have maybe 2 hours. You have a bunch of people just talking about stuff. I think unless you have that, you're not going to get much cohesive agreement on what's going on. And
it can't be covered in a tweet.
It can't be covered in 140 characters. I think there's definitely an importance to that. I think it's absolutely important that physicians are out there in the social media sphere, but it is dangerous. It is a minefield.
I know.
And I think you have to be careful with that.
And I'm thankful for them because there are definitely things that I have learned medically on Twitter, which is really bizarre, but that's where I'm getting, there'll be reports that I'll be able to read. I don't really know where else I would have access to these things right now. And so I'm very thankful that there are people out there that are putting that out there and you can read it, because I wouldn't have known or had access otherwise. Yeah. But I wouldn't want to be that person. That's what's terrible, so I don't know. It's
tough. I know my wife's always like, are you getting in trouble doing this? And I haven't. I don't know. I think I try and be pretty nuanced. I try and be honest. I don't know if that's helpful or not. Maybe I'm not big enough of a show to get enough ire. I know I've gotten a few nasty letters, but a lot of supportive. So I don't know. Just trying to have honest conversations, but it is fraught with risk, I suppose. Just like, if you come up across a deer, that deer might have COVID. It might give you COVID.
70%.
It's
probably higher.
It's
now,
like 80%
right?
now. Yeah.
That's crazy.
I still have not figured out how that's possible.
I don't want to know.
I don't know. Are people making out deer that I'm aware of?
Because
you can't get near. You can't get close. I don't know if there are people in this country listening who are not familiar with deer, but they're not exactly social animals like getting next to people. So I don't know how you get close enough.
Because they're
not indoors.
We were not in hunting season. Right?
Well, even here, hunting season, how are you going to get close to a deer? It's not like you're like wrestling deer.
You're out there though.
You talk to the hunters, if they're like 100 yards, they think they're close to a deer. I think the amount of viral load you've got breathing on a deer at 100 yards is like almost zero. There must be some intermediary, like a mouse or something, and then they get by the deer, right? There's got to be something else.
I don't know.
Or we just don't understand COVID as much as we think, which is entirely possible.
But that is crazy.
There could be like clouds of COVID moving around that I've heard people suggest that that's the case, but it doesn't really matter, I guess. The fact is that it's pretty much, I think, burning its course here and burning out. So I don't want to get you in more trouble. So I would direct people, if they want to find out more about you, to go to Speed Bump Kitchen.
Yes, that's my cooking site. It's totally not political.
It is fantastic, and it's great if you've got a kid with food allergies, especially. You have all kinds of, not gluten-free, but dairy-free.
Dairy, egg, and nuts are the big ones. So
yeah, and everything there looks like delicious. I've had a few things. You're a fantastic cook, so I would highly recommend anyone. Well, it's true. Highly recommend anyone check that out for recipes.
It's not controversial.
And you don't really tweet and stuff much, except when you had the issue with the licensure, which is I got to have you on about that because
I kind of stick towards I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I guess in the end, it all worked out right. It worked the way it's supposed to. People filed a complaint. It was found to be.
It was it was an interesting process. I don't know. I can see how it could be really stressful because I experienced that. But it was fine. I'm glad the process exists. But you really can get kind of reported for anything.
Crazy stuff. Yeah.
I'll feel for people, a little bit more now if it ever happens to them. So.
Well, Dr. Meg Edison from Grand Rapids, Michigan, thank you so much for being on The Paradox. And
you're welcome.
We'll hopefully have to talk again in the future.
Thanks for listening to The Paradox. If you like what the doc is doing, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. And share the show with your friends. Become a supporting listener to get access to special bonuses at patreon.com/theparadox. Show notes can be found at theparadox.com.
So you had asked me if I wanted to just do this over Zoom and not like be in person. I was like, no, we have to in person because it's pretty much my only flex is that like I know you and I can come over and like do this. Otherwise, I mean, you have all these famous people on here, and I'm one of the few. Who
I have so many famous people. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's outside of me. Yeah. Go ahead.